Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Today in this meeting, we are going to discuss about modality. We are from group 3, class 037. This group consists of 3 members. The first one is Ega Giana, and the second one is Fauzan Hadrian, and third one is me, myself, Mutia Putri. Okay, let's do the material. The first one is, what is modality? Modality is intermediate degrees between positive and negative poles that use modal verbs to express certain condition. And what the modality system does is to interpret the region of uncertainty that lies between yes and no. Then the space between yes and no has a different significance for proposition and proposals. So we are going to discuss about propositions and proposal. Okay, for the first one is propositions. In a proposition, the meaning of the positive and negative pole is asserting and denying. Positive, it is so, and negative, it isn't so. There are two kinds of intermediate possibility. The first one is degrees of probability, like possibly, probably, and certainly. These degrees is about the likelihood or probability of something happening or being. And the second one is degrees of usuality, like sometimes, usually, and always. These degrees is about frequency with which something happened or is. The use of modal in this proposition is called modalization. When a modal verb is used to express the speaker's opinion about a statement, then that is modalization. Both probability and usuality can be expressed in the same 3 ways. Like the first one is by a finite, like finite modal, like might, may, can, and will. Like you can see in the example, that will be John and he'll sit there all day. And the second one is by a mood adjunct of probability or usuality, like probably, perhaps, usually, or possibly. You can see the example, that's probably John. He usually sits there all day. Probably belongs to mood adjunct of probability, and usually belongs to mood adjunct of usuality. And the third ways is by both together. Like the example, that will probably be John. He will usually sit there all day. So all probably belongs to mood adjunct and finite of probability, and will usually belongs to finite and mood adjunct of usuality. For the way of saying about modalization or proposition, here's an example. There are 2 clauses. The first one is that's my book, and the second one is that's probably my book. The first clause has a positive meaning. That means it's really my book, and there's no doubt about it. But in the second clause that contains possibility, that clause has a doubt meaning, that it can be my book or it's not my book. In other words, the second clause is in between positive and negative poles. The use of adjunctional modal, probably in the second clause, is called modalization. The likelihood and frequency included in the modality. As you can see in the screen, the analysis of those 2 clauses.
Okay, we go on to the next material about proposals. In a proposals, the meaning of the positive and the negative pole is prescribing and proscribing. For the prescribing, it means the positive do it, and so we have to do it, what the speaker said. And the proscribing is the negative don't do it. So it's like the prohibition for us for doing something. And also there are two kinds of intermediate possibility depending on the speech function. It is divided into two, a comment or an offer. For a comment, the intermediate points represent degrees of obligation. So we could say that this is something we have to do it. So because it is a comment, when we express a comment, we could say with allowed to, supposed to, required to. For an offer, they represent degrees of inclination. So it is like the our willingness for doing something. We could say the inclination by saying willing to, anxious to, determined to. From the slide, we can see the modulation. Actually, the modulation is the degrees of obligation and inclination. That's why uh, we call them modulation. Okay, we go on to the next slide. Both obligation and inclination can be expressed in two ways. First, by a finite modal operator, such as such as should or will. We can see the example in the slides. You should know that. And the second one is I'll help them. And and then by an expansion of the predicator, typically by a passive verb and then adjective. In the example in the slide, you are supposed to know that it is the passive verb, and the next example is I am anxious to help them. It is the adjective. The note of the typical structure correlation of modulation models, it is the subject is a human, and the main verb is dynamic. The dynamic means is describing an activity that can be controlled. Okay, we go on to the next slide. It is the example. Do it. It means the hearer must do this command. We can see the you do, or the subject indefinite in the mood is implied, and do it is predicator and complement, so it is the residue. And the second one is you should do it. You is the subject, should is the finite or modal adjunct, and then do is predicator, it is complement. So you should is the mood, and do it is residue. Okay, we go on to the next slide. Kinds of modal. In modals itself, the first modals, it is can, could, should, ought, and etc. And and then mood adjuncts is the certainly, surely, probably. Um, this and then probability and obligation, it is certainly, surely, probably, etc. And the utility is always, often, usually, or rarely, ever, never, and etc. And intensity is the actually, seriously, quiet, almost, nearly, totally. For the inclination, willingly, readily, gladly. And the presumption, evidently, apparently, presumably. and the degree quiet almost nearly totally, and the last is the modal auxiliaries. Okay, the next material will be explained by Fauzan.
The next is value. Um, as you can see, there is a table according to the holiday. Based on the classification of modality, modality is further given three values. There is high, medium, and low, which is shown in the table. Generally speaking, all modal expressions are able to convey different degrees of modality meaning in terms of values. To finite modal operator, it is much clearer to observe. For the above two figures, for example, when expressing the meaning permission, can and may are the low value, like possible, sometimes, and not willing. Like that. In the obligation type of modality, which is represented by B, allow to, accordingly, will, and should express medium. Value of this type, which is then represented by b equals 2, while a high value of this type is conveyed by must and ought to, like certain, always, require, and determine. It can be represented by be required to. Moving on to the polarity. Polarity is the choice between positive and negative. Polarity is one way that allows speech function to be arguable in terms of exchange by setting up an opposition between yes and no, either is or isn't. Proposition. Either do or don't. Proposal. The polarity may be attached to either the feeling, temporal or modal, or the proportion. Thus, we may have I don't have to go, it's a feeling. I have to not go, is a proposition, which may also be combined. I don't have to not go. The difference between them may be shown with the question tag, where the unmarked form of the tag reverses the polarity. As such, if the polarity is attached to the feeling, we get she couldn't have known, could she? Moving on, polarity as contradicted. But if the polarity is attached to the proportion, it becomes the distinct modal adjunct, and the tag is reversed. She could have not known, couldn't she? And also there is a double. There is okay. Thank you. That's all, and yeah, that's all for